Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. Now, I'd like to start out by saying that waiting for us behind these doors is a lot of important information about the game, and I won't be able to go over all of it. So if in the end you want me to cover something else, please let me know. But for now, let's look at this note. Heir to the hidden ritual of blood, principal one of the bestowing of blood, touch the holy covering of the altar, and carve the adage of Master Lawrence into your body. Interesting stuff here, but I'm going to wait to talk about it until later. Right now, we have a scene to look at that's kind of unique. We're going to approach someone chanting to themselves in English. No Japanese subtitles are shown here, but there is a set of Japanese voiced lines, so I've provided a literal translation of those along with a written approximation. Here goes.
Our thirst for blood satiates us, soothes our fears. Seek the old blood. But beware, the frailty of men. Their wills are weak, minds young. The foul beasts will dangle nectar and lure the meek into the depths. Remain wary of the frailty of men. Their wills are weak, minds young. Were it not for fear, death would go unlamented. Seek the old blood. Let us pray, let us wish to partake in communion. Let us partake in communion and feast upon the old blood. Our thirst for blood satiates us, soothes our fears.
And in case you couldn't tell, from this point on the chant begins to repeat. So, despite showing you all of that information, there are only two main points that I'd like to emphasize for the time being, one from each of those translations. Let's start by going back to the translation of that note we read immediately after entering the cathedral. There's one translation in particular here that really stood out to me, both in terms of brevity and in terms of nuance. The first part of the message in the official English is, heir to the ritual of blood, purveyor of ministration. And it's that purveyor of ministration portion of it I want to focus in on, because my more literal translation was the far less economical principal one of the bestowing of blood. So obviously that's a lot of saved space in the official translation, but what I really like is the nuance that comes across in the term ministration. For one thing, I think it's obvious that when we read purveyor of ministration here in the Grand Cathedral of the Healing Church of Yharnam, we're talking about blood ministration. In other words, prior association and context allows the translators to save character space, which they've recognized. But it goes even deeper than that. The Japanese term here is chi no horokoshi, and the latter portion of that term, horokoshi, is associated with alms or charity. That's why my more literal translation involved the bestowing of blood. There's a sense here that those being addressed are going out and spreading their holy blood among all who need it. And this is where I think the choice of the word ministration really shines. It of course is derived from the word minister, which on the one hand has a religious association, appropriate enough considering the involvement of the healing church, and on the other hand has the meaning of attending to someone's needs, as a doctor ministers to a patient. By using the term blood ministration then, the official translation is able to call to mind the distribution of blood to the needy, the medical association of the term, and the religious association of the term. On top of that, it's shorter than a more literal alternative and sounds both naturally and tonally appropriate by the time we come across this note. I think it's a very impressive piece of work. Something else I'm impressed by, this time in Amelia's chant rather than the note in the cathedral, involves the handling of a rather technical aspect of the Japanese that I think is reflected in the overall tone of the chant. There's one line in particular which, if you have some familiarity with modern Japanese, may be confusing to you. I know it certainly stood out to me. It's the line that looks as if it should be translated, hope for blessing, and if you pray often, you will not be given communion. Yet even in my more literal translation, I've instead translated this last part as, surely you will be given communion. So considering the first part of the line, ending in the positive makes a good deal more sense than ending in the negative. But why, when the Japanese seems negative, should it be translated as a positive? Well, with a little research, I soon found that one of the quirks of an older form of Japanese is that there's another verb ending used to indicate that an outcome is likely to take place in the future, and when that's shortened, it looks identical to the modern Japanese abbreviation for a negative form. For a handy example of this, one need look no further than a familiar Bible verse's literary Japanese formulation. The phrase, Motome yo saraba ataeraren, is one translation of Matthew 7:7. Ask and it shall be given you. So not only do I think this is a great example of this form of Japanese in use, the parallels in the game are strong enough that I suspect the phrasing of the original Japanese may have been influenced by this particular Bible verse. To me, hope for blessing, pray often, and surely you will be given communion sounds like an awfully similar line of thinking to ask and it shall be given you. Of course, in the game, the focus is specifically on the imbibing of holy blood, but the parallels of this whole chant with the ideas of religious ceremonies and religious phrasing are strong enough that I think this particular set of dialogue really needed to take that into consideration, and the resulting translation, I feel, accomplishes the goal of sounding like a religious chant quite effectively. And now that we've beaten that boss and gone over all that information, it's time for us to take a look at one of the most important scenes in the game.
Master Willem, I've come to bid you farewell.
Oh, I know. You think now to betray me.
No, but you will never listen. I tell you, I will not forget our adage.
We are born of the blood, made men by the blood, undone by the blood. Our eyes are yet to open.
Fear the old blood. I must take my leave.
By the gods, fear it, Lawrence.
So as you can see, there are a lot of interesting translation choices here. Though to be fair, some of them probably seem like they involved bigger changes than is actually the case. This is a result of my being pretty far on the literal side of things for the sake of this comparison. For instance, the line which has the official translation of, "I must take my leave," sounds very different than, "I am indebted to you," but that's a bit deceptive. The Japanese phrase being used here, "osewa ni narimashita," is a fairly standard way of saying goodbye to someone after that person has taken care of you somehow. It does express the fact that the speaker feels gratitude for that care, but it's also something of a set phrase. It might help to think of it as like the 18th century phrase, "your obedient servant," at the close of a letter. The person who writes it almost certainly is not the literal obedient servant of the person the letter is being written to, but it's a way to potentially express respect and also to indicate that the letter is at an end. Here, Lawrence is respectfully taking his leave of Willem, just as he said he would do at the outset of the conversation. And so, "I must take my leave" is a phrase I find perfectly appropriate here. But before we get to our next topic, now that we know the sacred adage of the Grand Cathedral, and have read that that very adage is the password for this gate, let's have another chat with that crazy guard.
The password. The door is the door.
You don't seem well, but fear the old blood? And as it turns out, despite his somehow keeping that door closed, he's already dead. Setting that mystery aside though, let's get back to discussing some of the translation choices involved in that flashback scene we saw earlier. There are two things in particular that really stand out to me here. One is a bit of extra nuance that seems to come through from the Japanese, and the other involves the adage we just used to get past that dead guard. So to address that bit of nuance first, there's a moment towards the beginning of the scene when Willem says, "You think now to betray me." You may recall that my more literal version of this line was, "You too will betray," isn't that right? And the reason I use the word "to" here is because of the particle mo in the original Japanese. In this instance, the typical meaning of that particle is to indicate that the subject is not alone in whatever the rest of the sentence is. It's typically translated as to or also. There are other meanings that the particle can have, but in this instance, none seem as likely to me as if Willem was saying, "You too intend to betray me." This could imply that there are several other people who have already betrayed Willem, and it's an implication that doesn't really come across in the English. I'm not sure why that is, if it's an unusual usage of the particle, or if there's something I'm missing, but once again, it's interesting to see how small nuances can make a big difference, especially when sometimes changes that can seem drastic on first glance are actually not so extreme, as we saw with the line, "I must take my leave." This brings me to the second and final part of the translation of that scene that I wanted to talk about, as I think it falls into this same category. Just before Lawrence walks out, there's a point where they speak a set of lines together, culminating in what I've literally translated as, "Unknowing one, preemptively fear blood." In the official translation, this is rendered, "Our eyes are yet to open, fear the old blood." And I think what's on display here is really the power of context to influence a translation. What does context tell us? Well, we know from the Carol runes that Willem doesn't like to rely on blood. We know that eyes are important, think of insight and eyes on the inside from the third umbilical cord. And we know that the blood being discussed here likely isn't just any blood, it's the kind of blood used by the healing church. Couple all that with the idea that another way to express a lack of knowledge is to say that one cannot see, plus the idea of childhood implied by unopened eyes, kind of like with kittens, and I think you can see how this turns very effectively from a rough warning to a cryptic adage that fits the circumstances in the game perfectly. And of course, the core of the message is still to warn the ignorant to fear blood. But now, as we return to the Hunter's Dream, there's one last set of things I'd like to talk about before we end the episode. See that black bar at the bottom of the screen? It's filled with writing to indicate the doll is snoring. But what does this look like in English? As you can see, I still get that black bar at the bottom of the screen, but now there's no onomatopoeia. This is stylistically consistent with their removal of onomatopoeia such as Gilbert's cost from the rest of the game, but I used to find the specific instance of it very confusing. Now let's wake up the doll.
Welcome home, good hunter. I must have drifted off. What is it you desire?
So for the most part, I'd say those are some pretty straightforward translations, but there is one line I think it's worth highlighting. It's the one where the doll literally says, "I'm sorry, to somewhere," which I think is interesting because it's so vague. You'll note, of course, that it sounds particularly strange in English since the Japanese line trails off before getting to the verb. Even so, I'm intrigued by the strong sense that the doll's consciousness, at least, is implied to have been elsewhere. Possibly this means she was dreaming, or possibly it means something else, but there's a distinct sense of travel and also a loss of memory. As far as the translation is concerned, I can't help but be impressed by the final official line, especially considering how vague the Japanese is here. Drifted off similarly implies a kind of motion, sounds completely natural, makes sense in the context of her having been asleep, and even captures that same idea of her losing awareness. Again, I think this is a very impressive solution. And having said that, we've reached the end of another episode. Before saying goodbye though, I did want to officially announce that this series will be going on a bit of a break. The plan is to do some more relaxed Chalice Dungeon exploration in the meantime, but hopefully I can be back soon with more Translationborne. Until then, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, especially if there was anything you saw either in this episode or any of the previous episodes that you wanted me to address but that I didn't get to, please let me know. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope to be back with more Translationborne soon.